So full disclosure, this story is true, but you're probably not going to believe a word of it. You'll most likely dismiss it as a complete fabrication and go on with your life. Honestly, I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't experienced it firsthand. And there isn't much I can do to convince anyone that this is not something out of a Stephen King novel. Ironically enough, this incident is what got me into reading Stephen King's books. I've followed this channel for quite some time, and you seem to be a tad more accepting of these kind of bizarre stories than most other horror narration channels. There seems to be a trend with these unbelievable experiences. They always seem to happen when you're alone and almost always at night, and these are the exact circumstances of my unbelievable experience. By the way, I am a journalist for a large publication, and writing is what I do for a living. So I apologize if this comes off like a fictional creepypasta as opposed to a genuine experience. I'll try to remain as grounded and concise as I possibly can. Remember, kids, anything that you hear online you have to take with a grain of salt. I don't expect you to believe my story, but I will ask that you keep an open mind. So, it was the fall of 2006 in my hometown of Austin, Texas. I was a senior in high school back then. I found myself in the unfortunate position of having to walk to and from school every day because the transmission on my Chevy Malibu went bad, and I was saving up to buy a new car before I started college, which was roughly a year away. One morning, during homeroom, the entire school was called into the gymnasium for an important announcement. Once everyone was settled down, our principal, Mr. Keller, approached the podium and gave some rather unpleasant news over the screechy, outdated PA system. He informed us that one of our classmates, a young freshman named Stephanie, had died in a hit and run the day before. I vaguely remember hearing something about it on the radio, but I didn't know all the details until then. This was a tragedy, but also alarming. I didn't know the girl personally, but I couldn't help but thinking that if some unhinged madman was riding around town looking for high schoolers to run over, I was at risk of being a potential target. I was one of the only seniors to walk home when school let out. I couldn't ask any of my friends for a ride because most of them either took the bus home or had jobs they had to be at after school, and I refused to ride the bus for reasons that I'd rather not get into because I don't want to get sidetracked. Let's just say that my school had a good amount of assholes in attendance. My place was about a 20-minute walk from the campus. Not too bad, but the route I took led me down some rather obscured back roads that someone could easily disappear on. But I brushed off the notion that someone had deliberately killed the girl. I mean, Austin did have its fair share of drunk drivers, and it was also possible that it was just an irresponsible driver looking at a cell phone. I felt horrible about what happened to that poor girl, and I hoped the police could apprehend whoever took her life away at such a young age. 1 week later, the school held a memorial for Stephanie, and the police continued their investigation, but the community had pretty much moved on. It was a Friday. Me and a friend of mine, Mike, decided to ride over to his house after school and get his older brother, Roger, to buy us some alcohol. We all sat on the back porch and shot the shit for a while and played some darts. Before I knew it, it was midnight. I had some work-related stuff to do the next day, and I didn't really want to crash at Mike's place because it would just be more convenient for me to go home. Mike was passed out on the back porch, and I told his brother that my dad was coming to pick me up, which was a lie. I didn't want to inconvenience Roger by asking him to give me a ride home, and to be honest, I don't think he was in any condition to drive anywhere. I had been drinking myself, but I certainly wasn't drunk. My house is only about a 15-minute walk from Mike's place, so I drew a mustache on Mike's face with a black marker and said my goodbyes to Roger, and set off on foot. I eventually got to a dark, narrow back street that connected my neighborhood to Mike's. This stretch of road went on for about a half mile, but once you got to the end, my house was just around the corner. This road was almost completely dark at night. There were some dimly lit, old-fashioned lampposts that lined the sidewalk, but most of them didn't even work, and the ones that did provided very little light. This was a road I usually didn't take on my walks home from school, and I rarely ever walked the streets of Austin in the dead of night. So under the circumstances, I was feeling a bit on edge. I got about halfway down the road when suddenly, all the lampposts went out at once. Fucking great, I muttered to myself as a sense of unease in me began to grow. I stood still for about 5 minutes to allow my eyes to adjust to the darkness. There must have been a new moon out that night, because I don't recall any natural moonlight in the sky. However, after I eventually continued to make my way down the dark road, the tree formation to my right opened up, and there were some floodlights in the far distance that did brighten up things to where I could see where I was going again. After another minute or two, I heard something that made my blood literally turn to ice. It was the sound of a car engine roaring to life, followed by a loud rattling noise. It's the kind of sound that's commonplace at vintage car shows, but when you're alone on a dark, isolated road in the middle of the night, that sound is terrifying. I instantly remembered what happened to Stephanie a week prior, and I began to scan my surroundings, looking for whatever was producing that noise. I didn't even consider that I might have been overreacting. There were no headlights in sight, and the sound was coming from somewhere very close by, meaning that whoever started up the car was likely on the same road that I was on. I heard the engine rev up as if to confirm my worst fears. The sound of an engine revving when the driver is trying to antagonize you is distinctly different from when they're just showing off. The sound is always sharper and more animalistic. I had reached a section of the road where the distant floodlights were blocked out by a large stone wall that led to the entrance of my neighborhood. The road also curved, which meant there was nothing but an empty black void ahead of me, and I was reasonably sure that the rattling noise was coming from there. I dreaded the idea of having to walk towards the sound to get back to my house, so I decided that my best option was to just wait and see what would happen. The rational part of my mind was trying to convince me that this was some kind of prank, but the danger emanating from the darkness in front of me said otherwise. I slowly walked over to the opposite side of the road, towards the lamppost. As soon as I got to the other side, the engine suddenly stopped. As I stared into the dark, my heart began to beat faster. I could sense that some shit was about to go down. Suddenly, I was blinded by a pair of headlights. The phantom car shot out of the darkness ahead of me and came charging towards me like a heat-seeking missile. The blinding light and the engine noise had stunned me, and I only had seconds to act before the car rammed into me with the force of a freight train. I quickly leapt back towards the open road, just missing the car's metal frame by inches. I collapsed hard on the concrete as the sound of tires screeching rang out. I quickly stood up and turned around to see if the car was going to make another charge at me. But when I got to my feet, I saw nothing. I was looking at an empty street. There was nothing. The lampposts that had left me in the near dark were now back on. Well, at least some of them were. I was awestruck. What the fuck just happened? There was no way a car that had just missed me by mere inches could vanish into thin air without so much as a fading headlight. In the moments that followed, I wasn't quite sure what to do with myself. After the panic and shock subsided, I decided the best course of action was to haul ass back to my house. I went through all the possibilities. Perhaps I drank more than I thought, and I was almost hit by a passing car. But that doesn't hold up because I've been completely shit-faced before, and I was well above my limit that night. The car's engine revving up in the dark was enough to chase away any buzz I was feeling at that moment. I remember the headlights rushing towards me and seeing my life flash before my eyes right before jumping out of the way. This thing sounded like someone put a lot of work into the engine to make it sound like a monster. I only caught a quick glimpse of what was behind the headlights. I'm certain that it was one of those classic muscle cars you see at shows, maybe a GTO or possibly an old Camaro. But what still baffles me is that it seemed to disappear as soon as I jumped out of its way. I hit the ground, heard the tires screeching, then quickly got up. I kept what happened to myself. What was I going to tell everyone? That I was almost flattened by a ghost car? To this day, I'm still not sure what to make of this. I sometimes entertain the possibility that it was some kind of freakish nightmare, but I know that's bullshit. It's worth noting that the local police never found the car that hit Stephanie, and her death remains unsolved. Let me give you some background before I begin my story. This took place in the summer of 2014. I'm a female who was 22, turning 23 that fall. I don't want to share my location, so I'll be making some minor changes for privacy reasons. I live in a small college town. I've lived there my whole life, and I've graduated from there. There's a lot of history in this little town, but unfortunately we do have a drug problem here. Other than that, we don't get a whole lot of crazy around our small town. I worked at a gas station that was owned by a family member. My husband and I worked opposite shifts. I was the early bird, so I would work the morning shift. I would get up around 3:30, 4 o'clock, and open the store by 5. I was never worried about walking out to my car in the dark because I grew up living in the countryside outside of town. I loved being outside, even when it was dark. I used to lie in the grass and look up at the stars. When my friends would come over, we would always play Ghost in the Graveyard at night and did your typical teenager stuff during dark hours. Just messing around and having a little fun. We owned about 4 acres of land, and no one ever bothered us, so I was used to being outside in the dark with no fear at all, which I'm not too fond of because I was so used to being in an open space, and I was never really a city girl, even to this day. Now that you've got some background, let's get into the story. Now this is going to be a 2-part story, so bear with me, because both of these incidents occurred very close to each other. As I mentioned before, it was the summer of 2014. I was getting ready for work like I usually did. When I got into my car, I started pulling out of my apartment's driveway. I then noticed a man walking down the road, pulling a suitcase behind him. As I got closer, I began to wonder why someone would be walking down the street pulling a suitcase at 4:40 in the morning. I thought about pulling up next to him and rolling down my window to ask him if he needed me to call the police or something, but I was suspicious. I grew up being told not to talk to strangers or to pick up hitchhikers, so there was no way that I was going to let a stranger into my car. But I'm also a nice person, and I'm always willing to help in any way that I can. But I wouldn't do something that could put my life in danger. When I pulled out of the driveway, the man then started walking right towards my vehicle. I remembered losing my nerve and took off down the street. I looked into my rearview mirror to see him just standing there watching me. I knew something was off about this person, and I was also thankful that I didn't offer to help him. Some of you might think, oh, you're just over-exaggerating. But come on, why would this man come right at my vehicle? And what the hell was he doing walking with a suitcase in the middle of the street at 4 o'clock in the morning? Once I reached my work, I called the police and reported it. I told them that I was just a concerned citizen, and I have been living in this neighborhood for the past 4 years, and I had never seen this man before. The police told me that they would send a car out to patrol the area. Hours went by, and I didn't hear anything from them. So I decided to call them back and inquire if they found anything. They told me that there was no trace of the man. So I just brushed it off and went about my day. I later mentioned it to my husband after my shift, and he told me that it was probably someone returning home from the airport or something. But the nearest airport is about an hour's drive away. My husband thought I was just overreacting about the whole thing. A few weeks later, I was talking to one of my customers and brought up this incident. It's a small town and everyone talks to everyone around here. As soon as I mentioned the man with the suitcase, my customer looked like he crapped his pants. He then started telling me that the police had recently discovered bodies in suitcases in our county. All the hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up, and my heart began to pound out of my chest. My customer asked me if I remembered what he looked like, but I didn't really get a good look at him. I'm not 100% sure if the man that I saw was the suitcase killer, but regardless, I'm glad I didn't stop to help that man. A couple of months later, I was again getting ready for work. I headed out of the back door of my apartment. My husband and I lived at the end of the hallway, so I figured I would just park my car close to the back door because I thought it would be easier than going all the way down the hallway. Plus, a lot of the front parking spots are always taken. When you go out of the back door, there are these huge pine trees lining a cement pathway that guides you to the back parking lot. It was still dark out, and the moment that I opened the back door, straight ahead was the dark figure of a large man running straight towards me. I didn't hesitate and I slammed the door shut and rushed back into my apartment. My heart was pounding violently inside my chest. I was in full-on flight mode. I had never run so fast in my life. The moment that I reached the bedroom, my husband literally sat straight up and asked me if I was alright. After I explained to him what was going on, he stood up from the bed and headed to our door to look through the peephole to see if there was anyone in the hallway. He saw nothing, so he opened the door a crack and started looking around, but there was no one there. I was still shaking, even when my husband walked me out to my car. I'm lucky to have such a great guy for a husband. Later that day, when my husband arrived at the gas station for his shift, he told me from now on to park in the front where the lights were. The same week, I ended up buying some pepper spray just in case I needed it in the future. It's been about 7 years, and I still haven't used it, thank God. But I want to warn you all, even though you feel like you're safe in your own neighborhood, you still have to take precautions. Make sure that you park in well-lit areas if you're going to work very early like me. Always have a can of pepper spray or some sort of protection. You need to be aware of your surroundings, because you never know if there's someone hiding in the shadows, waiting for you to let your guard down. There are a lot of freaks roaming the streets, and you have to be careful out there, and if something doesn't feel right, follow your gut. When I was 21, I lived with my ex-boyfriend in Southern California. It was the first time in my life that I was on my own and had the freedom of being out from under the watchful eyes of my parents, which made me a bit reckless. We lived in what was considered to be a safe neighborhood. Nice houses lined the streets. Cal State University was nearby, and we rarely heard of violent crimes happening in the area. One late Friday night in July, at approximately 1 a.m., my boyfriend and I got bored and wanted to get out of our hot apartment. We decided to walk several blocks away to a lovely park that had an artificial lake where ducks and geese would gather. There were benches around the lake where you could sit and watch the water. The sky was clear, the moon was out, and it was a hot summer night in Orange County. The park was surrounded by an expanse of towering trees and thick bushes. My boyfriend was a naturally thin guy with long hair. I was 5'5" and weighed 100 pounds at the time. We sat on a bench to watch the rippling water as the moonlight reflected off its surface, with the trees and bushes at our backs. Out of nowhere, the bright headlights of a police cruiser came speeding through the adjacent parking lot, the vehicle's frame bouncing off the concrete speed bumps as red and blue lights flashed. It then came to a screeching stop, and a spotlight was shined into the trees. We both thought, "Shit, we aren't supposed to be here. The hell do we do?" We may or may not have been under the influence. This was remarkably bad timing. We knew the police saw us, so we just stayed because if we started running, we would risk being chased down and arrested. However, the cop didn't approach us right away. We looked on for a while and wondered, what the hell's going on over there? We thought maybe the officer caught a drug deal going down. We couldn't make out a whole lot through the trees. Eventually, the cop approached us. We thought for sure that we would get arrested or fined for being in the park while it was closed. What the officer told us was truly terrifying. He was doing a routine patrol when he spotted a man in the trees watching us. He then told us that since my boyfriend had long hair and was thin, the man hiding in the trees most likely assumed that we were both females, seeing us from behind. My boyfriend's ego was shattered. Once the cop saw that the stalker was slowly moving closer to us, that's when he decided to turn on his lights and rush in. What he found on the man was alarming. He found an arsenal of knives, handcuffs, zip ties, duct tape, and a gun. The kidnapper's field kit, basically. I was overwhelmed by fear. We were very lucky that the cop had seen him creeping around in the bushes, because it would not have ended well for us. We thanked the officer and proceeded to walk the few blocks back to our apartment in silence. I feel very lucky to be alive today, and we never returned to that park again. When I was 16, I frequently snuck out and explored abandoned buildings in my area and would do dumb teenager stuff with my two friends, Aaron and Tristan. We lived in a small town in Ireland. On this particular night, it was around 10 o'clock, and we had just finished up a 2-hour gaming session on Call of Duty. We had made plans to go explore an abandoned gas station we had recently discovered earlier that week. We arrived at the desolate gas station, which was located down an overgrown road that was so old that there wasn't even any streetlights on it. While we were walking up to the old building, Tristan saw a car sitting at the far end of the parking lot. It was an old gray Nissan. We wondered how it could have made it through the overgrown road. Tristan seemed on edge and asked if we should just go. Aaron teased him about being a little bitch, and I played along. But deep down, I felt that the car did seem a bit sketchy. We went over to inspect the old Nissan, and it appeared to be in surprisingly good condition. Looking back, that should have been our first red flag. We then made our way to the gas station. The front door and all the windows on the first and second floors were all boarded up, so we did a full 360 around the place and found out that the back door had an old cheap lock keeping it closed. Aaron picked up a discarded fence post and hit the lock until it broke. As Aaron pushed open the door, a jingling sound echoed through the store. We all jumped back in surprise, but soon realized it was just one of those bell chains that go off when a door opens. We stepped inside and began poking around. The inside of the structure was underwhelming, with random debris lying here and there, and some old shelves that were once used for inventory. We saw all there was to see on the first floor, so we made our way upstairs. It was just one large office room with chairs, desks, and a large table that sat in the center of the room. Aaron took out 3 bottles of beer from his bag, and that's when we started to loosen up and pull some chairs together. After a little bit of drinking, our laughter was cut short by what we first thought were police sirens. But then we realized it was the alarm of the Nissan parked outside. I looked through the hole in one of the boarded windows to see a large, bald man standing beside the car. I dropped my bottle on the ground in shock. The bottle smashed against the floor, and the man turned his attention to the windows. We dropped to the floor and hid under the large table and waited for what felt like an hour until the alarm stopped. That's when we all heard the bells downstairs jingling as the door creaked open. I felt like my heart was going to burst out of my chest as we heard the man say,
"I know you're here."
He then started shouting threats, saying that we made a big mistake coming here and vandalizing his car. This confused us because we didn't do anything to his car whatsoever. We then heard the man's heavy footsteps slowly coming up the stairs. From our hiding spot, I got a good look at the man as he emerged. He was a fairly large man who looked like he could easily take on the 3 of us. He started scanning the room, and I remember him saying in a disturbing voice,
Come out, wherever you are."
The man began approaching the back of the table. Aaron then did something that caught everyone off guard. He leapt out from under the table and smashed his beer bottle over the man's head, causing him to collapse upon the floor. As he toppled over, a large knife fell from his hand. We ran as fast as we could out of that place, hearing heavy footsteps coming down the stairs as we did. We ran into the surrounding forest and made our way through the trees until we got back to my house. I never felt more grateful to be alive after I got back. It's been 2 years since that night, and I still don't know what would have happened if that unhinged man caught us. And I don't think I want to know. I grew up in a decent-sized town that was about 45 minutes to an hour away from the second biggest city in the state, known for its 3 rivers and many bridges. I am the youngest of 3 boys. My mother was the general manager at my grandfather's golf course, and my father was a lieutenant for the state police at the time. We were not well off, but we were far from poor. Cop Dad was hard on us when he needed to be, but me and my brothers learned to always be respectful no matter what. Due to some family drama I'd rather not get into, I've never been super close with my brothers or my parents. Despite that, I'll admit that this situation has made me appreciate my dad more. We seem to have only one thing in common. We would protect the ones that we love at all costs, even if that meant our lives. I had gone to the downtown area to hang out with my friends at a place that was about a half a mile away from the high school's football stadium. Since we were teenagers at the time, we all rode our bikes. After a while, I realized that my bike was missing. My friends and I checked around the immediate area, and after we came up empty, I called my dad, knowing that he was home from work. He drove down to where I was. We all figured he would be pissed at us, but surprisingly he wasn't. I guess he was in a good mood that day. All my friends got on their bikes and went off in different directions towards their own homes, saying that they would keep an eye out for my bike. As my dad and I were driving back home, we saw a group of 3, 2 males and 1 female, walking down a side street towards us. One of the males was pushing my bike as they walked, causing me to snap to attention and tell my dad, "Hey, they have my bike." My dad stopped immediately and pulled over, and we jump out. I laughed inside, watching my dad go full-blown hard-ass cop on the 3 delinquents. He had the girl and one of the guys stand against the wall with their noses touching it, and he slammed the other guy with the bike to the ground. I grabbed my bike and put it in the bed of my dad's truck. Since it was only 2 of us against 3, my dad told me, "Rick, get in the truck so they don't see your face." I responded, "Fuck that," and stubbornly stood there in full view until the cops came and arrested all 3 of them, a decision I would come to regret. Fast forward about 2 years later, I was 18, and I had returned home from military school. Some of the things I learned during my time there helped me out. One night I was out jogging around 6 p.m. when a car flew past me. It then slowed down and came to a halt at a stop sign down the road. Thinking that it was odd that the car was just sitting there, watching me, I memorized the car's details as best I could as I jogged past. My house happened to be on this street. As I approached my front door, the car finally continued down the street and moved slowly past my house. I didn't really think much of this. Perhaps someone was just lost or something. Fast forward to about a week later, and I was finishing up another jog. I walked into my house through the front door, which leads directly into the kitchen. The moment I walk over to the sink by the window to splash some cold water on my face, I hear a loud bang from outside, followed by 3 others in quick succession. Thanks to my background, I knew gunfire when I heard it, and I quickly dropped down and crawled to the door, grabbing one of my brother's baseball bats before running outside. Even though I knew a bat had 0 chance against a firearm, I guess I was hoping that I would surprise them and smash the shooter in the face before he had a chance to draw down. Once I was outside, I saw a pair of taillights disappearing down the street. I recognized the vehicle from a week earlier. Thankfully, no one else besides me was home at the time. In our town, word got around fast. My brothers joked around with me, asking me smart-ass questions like, "Did you try being a hero when no one else was around?" They thought I was crazy for running outside towards gunfire with nothing but a baseball bat. It was about 2 or 3 days later when we received a call from the police. They informed us that they had caught the perpetrator. As it turns out, it was the same guy who stole my bike 2.5 years earlier. The guy had received 10 years for attempted murder with a firearm. I would later find out that he was released early. So we went on with our lives, and I became an EMT. When I was 26, I returned to my hometown to visit my parents. When I walked into the kitchen, there was a newspaper resting on a table, the front headline reading, "Local woman missing, vehicle found abandoned." As I started reading through the article, I almost immediately flipped over the kitchen table out of rage. According to the article, the missing woman's boyfriend was the same guy who had stolen my bike all those years ago and shot at my parents' house. He wasn't arrested or charged with any crime connected to the missing woman. From that day on, I always made sure I was carrying a pistol, except when I was on the job. I distanced myself from my family for a time, until I worked through some bouts of paranoia. But as they say, life goes on. I still work as an EMT to this day, and the guy who shot at my house is currently in prison on charges unrelated to the missing woman, who was found dead sometime later. Back in 2014, I joined a Facebook group that was started specifically for people who are from the town I grew up in Southern California. The whole group shared memories of the town, and everyone seemed nice, except for one person. There's always at least one asshole. This guy got on the bad side of one of the admins, whose name was Robert, and ended up being booted from the group. I'll note that I was in my mid-30s at the time, and most of the members were at least 20 years older than me. Robert was approaching 60 and was married with children who were about my age. Robert took a liking to me. Since he was married, I didn't think his friendship would go any further than that, but I was mistaken. He said that I was a down-to-earth girl and was easy to talk to. He and I exchanged phone numbers, and he would message me quite a bit. However, Robert took it a step further and found out where I lived, my landline number, and my mother's address in California. He had a subscription to one of those sites that contain information on people, their age, phone numbers, possible relatives, previous addresses, etc. He found out through Facebook when my birthday was, and he sent me flowers. I thanked him, but I started to get suspicious. His behavior was becoming alarming. He started complaining that all his wife wanted from him was his pain pills and money. Around this time, I met the man who would eventually become my husband, and of course, I announced it on Facebook. Robert went into a ballistic rage upon hearing this, saying that I should have known that he was in love with me. I told him, "You're married. Why are you in love with another woman?" He began texting me at least 10 to 20 times a day, going from calling me hateful names to profusely apologizing. I blocked his number, so he started blowing up my landline. Most of the time I kept it unplugged, so I didn't get most of the voicemails that he would leave. One day, out of curiosity, I did listen to some of the voicemails I got. In one of the messages, he claimed that I owed him $13,000. He then started making threats about how he would come to where I lived and would also pay my mother a visit. I blocked him on my landline and informed my mother about the situation. Robert got clever and started texting me from random numbers located all over California. He even sent letters to my home, and nothing he said in those letters made any sense. That's when I decided that I needed a restraining order. I tried twice through my county court, but since I lived in Washington State at the time, the judge wouldn't grant it since we lived in different states. Once Robert found out that I couldn't file a restraining order, he sent me more hateful messages and told me that I would never get rid of him. So I went back to court with the new messages. For this new hearing, Robert mailed in a letter of rebuttal. He claimed that he was a civil servant who had worked at a school district at one time and was an electrician by trade. He also said that he was on disability and couldn't drive longer for more than a half an hour without experiencing excruciating pain, and posed the question,
How could he possibly come to Washington State? I told the judge that this wasn't true, because he openly posted all day about his motorcycle trips to Malibu on Facebook. Regardless of the evidence, I wasn't granted a restraining order, and I felt failed by the system. I blocked him on all social media, emails, and phone numbers, but he obviously would still call using new numbers. He made a duplicate Facebook page with my profile picture and sent out friend requests to all of my friends. He had my real Facebook profile blocked, and I found out when a friend messaged me. "I got a friend request from you, but I already thought we were friends." My friend then told me that this fake profile of mine was making all kinds of posts talking shit about me. My friend reported it, and thankfully Facebook took it down. I changed my cell phone number, and I eventually moved into a new place. Things died down for a while, but Robert somehow found me on LinkedIn. After that, I straight up deleted LinkedIn and Facebook, and I saw that he even followed me on my YouTube page. I don't know how to remove someone, so I just blocked him there. To wrap up this insane story, I've included a couple of recordings of the messages he left.
"Hey, I need you to unblock me and respond to me, please. Would you consider doing that? That's the Christian thing to do, don't you think? Please, I'm not playing around. Bye." Look, if you don't respond to me, you're not leaving me too many choices here, and there only leaves me one, and I don't want to do that, and I don't want to blindside you. I wish you would just talk to me. We could work this out, but obviously you don't want that. But you're not leaving me much of choice, and I won't be going after a paycheck. Bye.
I'm a bit rusty on storytelling, but I'll do my best. My name is Caitlin. I'm a 21-year-old female, but I was 19 at the time. I had recently taken over my parents' 2-bedroom apartment in Kentucky with my 2 dogs, Kylo and Finn. I invited my boyfriend Isaac and my friend Aaron to come and live with me. They would have to share the rent, of course. The apartment wasn't in the best area. A lot of addicts roamed around at night, but it was affordable and allowed me to have my pets. To help with the story, I'll have to explain the layout of my apartment building. The building had 3 stories. The bottom was a basement level with 2 apartments and a parking garage. There were stairs that led to the 2nd story, which consisted of 4 apartments, mine being directly to the left. Beside my door was another flight of stairs that led up to the 3rd floor. I lived in one of the 2 apartments on the 2nd floor that had a yard, since they were technically on ground level. One night, Isaac and I were walking the dogs, and planned on settling down and going to bed afterwards. We went around the building because my dogs were not very friendly to strangers, and someone had just pulled up out front. Kylo and Finn are both 45-pound border collies, and while they don't seem like much, their barks are deep and intimidating. I always tried to not let them scare our neighbors or their kids. Plus, I would never want them to hurt anyone. I don't think that they would, but I'm not going to take a chance on it. I love my dogs very much, but a lawsuit does not sound fun to deal with. While they were using the bathroom and I was talking with Isaac, we noticed a guy in a pink shirt leaning against the wall of the apartment across from ours. At the time, the apartment was vacant and was used for storage. Nobody lived there, and nobody ever used it at night. So seeing this guy standing there was a bit sketchy, but we paid him no mind. The man then calls out to us, "Hey!" We ignored him, since we had no idea who he was, and again, my dogs are not very friendly to strangers. Finn obviously heard this and started growling and barking, causing Kylo to do the same. So I whispered to my boyfriend, "Let's just avoid this creep and go back around front so the dogs can finish up." We continued as normal while the dogs sniffed around. Our conversation was cut short again as my dog started barking and growling. Towards the entrance of the building was the man in the pink shirt watching us. We had walked further down into the other yards to avoid him, and there he was in front of our building. There was no telling how long he had been there, watching us. As soon as we noticed him, he left the entrance and walked through the yard and disappeared behind the building. The dogs finished up their business, and we headed for the front entrance. As soon as we got to the door, the guy in the pink shirt and some other guy with glasses were darting up the back stairwell towards us. I ushered my boyfriend and the dogs inside and slammed the door and quickly locked it as soon as they reached it. We hadn't lived in the area long, but I had gotten to know some of the other tenants in the building, as well as some of the people in the neighboring apartment building. This was so strange and out of nowhere for me. I had never seen these guys around these buildings before. Just like clockwork, there were 3 gentle, spaced-out knocks. I looked through the peephole and saw the 2 men standing outside our front door. I was definitely not going to open the door to find out what they wanted. When we didn't open up, they knocked again. Again, we refused to answer. You'd think that they would give up and just go away, but instead they proceeded to bang on our door and yell at us. "Open the fucking door!" At this point, we started freaking out, and Aaron had come out of his room and was watching the back windows, and Isaac kept an eye on the front door. After a while, the knocking and shouting died down. That's when Isaac said, "Hey, I think they left. I don't see anyone out there now." We started to calm down, but that didn't last long. Aaron then shouted, "They're looking at our windows. I think they're trying to find a way inside." We then hear a loud thump come from one of the windows, followed by Aaron shouting, "They threw a rock at the window. What the hell is going on? Who are these guys?" There then came a loud, scratching noise at the front door. Isaac rushed to look. The man in the glasses would step out of view of the peephole and would stand right next to the door. They would continue to bang on our door demanding that we come out, all the while making that scratching sound or throwing things at our windows. None of us felt comfortable calling the cops because we were hardcore stoners with paraphernalia all over our apartment. And of course we had smoked earlier that day. So paranoia got the better of us, and it just didn't seem like a good idea to call the police. Instead, I went to the very back of my apartment, where I couldn't be heard, and called my parents. My dad is a big guy, 6'3", and built like a tank. My mom answered the phone, and once I informed her of the situation, she used my dad's phone to call my cousin. My cousin lived closer to me and also owned a gun, so he bolted over in his Jeep and parked across the street from our apartment so we could view the inside of the entryway. He confirmed that the guys were running around and hiding, going around the building and trying to find a way inside. One of them even attempted to crawl up the balcony. My mom told my cousin not to confront them and to wait for her and my dad to show up. These guys kept this up for 40 minutes. Eventually, my cousin lost sight of them. Soon after, my parents got there and saw a group of people in a big circle beating the shit out of the guy in the pink shirt. I immediately came out of my apartment and watched as my mom got out of the car screaming, "Who the hell was knocking on my daughter's door?" Everyone scattered, and the guy in the glasses pointed at the guy in the pink, now bloodstained, shirt, who was just getting off the ground. I watched as my dad walked up to him and asked him what his problem was. He then stuttered out a half-assed apology and said, I didn't mean to." My dad proceeded to ask him why he kept at it for an hour. After more mumbling, my dad picked up the guy by his shirt and flung him at least 4 feet away. I'll never forget how my dad yelled at him to get the hell away and to never come back to these apartments again. Right after this, the cops pulled up and asked us what was going on. Eventually, the cops explained that they had received a call about a group of people beating up some kid. So the call wasn't even related to the non-stop harassment that me and my roommates endured. They confirmed that something had happened at my door because of the long, deep scratch marks, which they concluded were made by a knife. I can't even imagine how the situation would have gone if we would have opened that door. It turns out that the kid had confused my boyfriend for some other guy he wanted to fight, who lived in the building next to ours. After our lease was up, we all moved away. Aaron went back to his home state, and Isaac and I moved in with my parents. About 4 months later, my mom found an article about the same guy. His name was Isaiah Harvey. He burned down a house in a nearby town. I'm so glad that we didn't open the door that night, and we didn't have our apartment burned down with my dogs inside of it. I can never thank my dad enough for getting there as fast as he did, or my cousin for coming and keeping an eye out. As a final note, seriously guys, always be aware of your surroundings. If you get a weird feeling about someone, it's best just to stay the hell away from them. This happened in the summer of 2019. I'm from Morgan Hill, California, but this story happened in the town next to mine, Gilroy. Every year, Gilroy throws a festival to attract people to the local businesses and to generate a little revenue. I used to go every year when I was a kid with my family, but the festival became more and more shady as the years went by. I was 21 at the time, and my boyfriend Will and I were going to meet up with my aunt and cousin at their booth. It was their first year as vendors, so I wanted to show my support. 3 important things to note. 1, it was my boyfriend's first time going. 2, my cousin was 8 months pregnant at the time. And 3, my cousin's first daughter had decided not to go that day, so she stayed with my uncle at his house, which was down the street from where the festival was. We parked at my uncle's house and said our hellos before walking over. Luckily for us, we got in free because of my aunt. I noticed the security wasn't very tight, because Will walked in with his Leatherman multi-tool in his belt, and they didn't even bother checking me. After making our way through the crowd, we finally got to the tent where my family was. Maybe after 25 minutes of being there, my cousin went off to the bathroom, and Will walked off to take a look at another booth while I was still talking with my aunt. 5 minutes go by, and I hear a loud pop. Everyone around either thinks it came from the jump house 200 feet away, or a firecracker went off. For once, I listened to my instincts and made eye contact with my aunt. Within the next 30 seconds, rapid gunfire and bullets were flying through the tents, as hundreds of people were screaming and running for their lives. Like everybody else, I jumped for cover, and I saw 2 kids standing still. I threw them under me to protect them, and their mom came running over and jumped on top of me to protect all 3 of us. They eventually crawled out and hid next to a table that had been turned over. I laid flat on my stomach, watching my aunt. I heard her screaming for my cousin, and that's when I really started to panic. I had always heard that in dangerous situations, you have one of 2 responses: fight or flight. Mine was fight. I stood up and ran out of the tent, screaming for my cousin. Bullets were still flying past me, and I stayed as low as possible to make my way towards the bathrooms. However, I never made it past the tent, because Will appeared out of nowhere and yanked me by my ankle, and dragged me under the table that he was hiding under. My boyfriend is a very calm and collected guy, so seeing his face turn white scared the hell out of me. I then heard a loud whistle, followed by something falling on my head. I felt my hair, and discovered that a bullet casing had landed on me. During all the commotion, we somehow didn't realize that the shooter had been standing right next to us. Will and I made a break for it, and I ran so fast that I kicked my left shoe off. It's a miracle that we didn't get mowed down by this psychopath. Finally, the cops showed up and began to open fire at the shooter, causing him to take cover. My brain clicked that I needed to run. Another thing to note here is that I was a cross-country and track athlete for years, but I had to stop because of a knee injury. But in that moment, it was like my body said fuck it, and my knee snapped into place, and I ran like I was in high school again. We made it out of the park, and I immediately called my uncle. He told us to get to his house fast. As soon as I saw him outside the house, I collapsed into his arms, crying my eyes out, saying that I couldn't find my aunt or my cousin. 15 minutes later, we see my aunt and her friend who had been working the booth with her. They came around the corner, and then we hugged and cried for what felt like an hour. Neither of them had heard from my cousin, so we sat there waiting in fear. We finally got word from my cousin. She had been put onto a bus with a bunch of kids and had been taken to a field where people parked their cars for the event. When we got there, we broke down in tears and embraced each other. She wasn't hurt, but she said the initial pop everyone heard was a misfire that landed by her feet. She said she looked up and saw the shooter reloading his gun and then taking aim into the crowd. And that's when all hell broke loose. We were in lockdown at my aunt's house for the next 6 hours. When the police finally let us go, I held Will's hand the entire ride home, asking if he was okay. He had been close to the shooter when everything went down. He ran through all the tents, flipping tables out of his way to find me. He saw a guy getting shot and collapsed on who he assumed was his girlfriend. He saw her holding him, watching as the life faded from his eyes. He still doesn't like talking about that day. I ended up with one black eye, bruised and scratched knees, and a big lump on my forehead. I thank whatever higher power out there that I only suffered these minor injuries. It took 3 months, but the FBI finally interviewed me and gave me my shoe back. They told us that it took so long to get our things back because of how close we were to the chaos. After going for therapy over the next year, I feel a lot less anxious talking about it. I still jump at loud bangs, but I'm still healing. 3 lives were ended that day, and the town of Gilroy still mourns their losses. Our community is trying to rebuild itself after this incident, and with COVID happening, I think it'll be some time before the festival is brought back. I think about that day quite often, and how lucky my family was to be able to walk away unscathed. If you want to look up what happened, search Gilroy Garlic Festival Shooting 2019, and stay safe out there, everyone. I have submitted this story under a pen name to protect my identity. During the late 90s, I was at a very low point in my life. I was a drug addict, wandering the streets of downtown Los Angeles, eating out of trash cans, sleeping under bridges, and asking random bypassers for spare change. Looking back, I have nothing but regret for that time in my life. But this story is about the incident that made me sober up and turn my life around. One night I was sleeping under a secluded highway overpass. It was fairly isolated because of its location on the outskirts of the city, and saw little to no police presence. My sleeping spot overlooked a concrete foundation that stretched on for about 50 yards. It was a pretty long walk to get back to the city, but it was a price that I was willing to pay to have this place all to myself. I've had more than my fair share of close calls sleeping on Skid Row. So after a long day of panhandling, I slipped into my sleeping bag and began to doze off. I was suddenly woken up by the sounds of screaming. I turned to my side to see a car parked under the overpass, but the vehicle's windows were down. I could tell that there was commotion taking place inside the cab. Now I know what you might be thinking. At first, I thought the same thing too. Maybe someone was getting lucky. But these were not screams of pleasure. They were screams of agony. A chain-link fence bordered the concrete platform beneath the overpass, and at night, a white light next to the fence would turn on and partially illuminated the area. It wasn't the best lighting, but you could still see the area from my sleeping spot. I watched in horror as the passenger side door of the car flung open, and a skimpily dressed woman exited the vehicle. She was holding her leg, trying her best to limp away from the car. I was frozen in place, almost not believing what I was witnessing. The girl was begging for her life as she awkwardly staggered away from the vehicle. The driver's side door then opened, and a figure emerged from the car. I couldn't quite make out the details of this person because the passenger side of the car was facing me. The person then pointed a gun at the girl and shot her. I remember closing my eyes as the gun went off and opening them to see the woman sprawled out on the ground. She was on her back, and the way her head was positioned was as if she was looking at me. Her jaw was going up and down like she was trying to say something. The memory of seeing her like that still haunts me. The shooter made his way over to her, and when he stepped into the light, I could see that he was wearing a dark hooded jacket with a bandana hiding his face. He stood over her and just watched her for several seconds before finishing her off with a second shot. I was absolutely petrified at what I had just witnessed. I was now sitting up on my sleeping bag with one hand over my mouth, trying my best not to make a sound. But what happened next was a whole new level of fucked up. The headlights of another vehicle at the opposite end of the overpass flicked on and drove up to the gruesome scene. At first I was relieved and stupidly thought that these people were here to help, not even factoring in that a bystander wouldn't just casually drive up to a scene of a crime with the killer still there with a loaded gun. I guess after I witnessed something so horrible, the logical part of my brain wasn't working too well. But things became clear to me once I noticed that the other vehicle was a black van, and things became even more clear once I saw 3 men wearing ski masks exiting the van, one of them holding a video camera. These sick fucks were filming this entire thing? There was an exchange of words, and the other 2 men that exited the van walked over to the dead woman and grabbed her arms and legs, then proceeded to carry her body back to the car. The shooter had made his way over to the car before they got there, and the cameraman stayed off to the side and filmed the entire thing. The shooter popped open the trunk, and the men heaved the corpse into it. Without going into too much detail, I'll add that the men did not seem to be concerned at all about the blood. The cameraman then joined them at the car for a nice close-up shot. The shooter then walked over to the van and returned with 2 cans of gas. The men doused the car in gasoline, and the shooter struck a match and threw it, and the car was instantly engulfed in flames. The 4 men and myself watched as the car burned. As I stared into the fire, I became numb. I had apparently reached my scare limit, and now I was just angry. Angry at these animals for what they had done. Even if this woman was an addict or a hooker, no one deserves to die like that, murdered under an overpass in cold blood. The fact that they were filming this whole thing pissed me off even more. I considered this to be the exact moment I stopped being a drug addict. The 4 men eventually piled back into the van and left. A short while later, I emerged from the overpass and made my way over to the nearest payphone to call the police. I don't think the police took me seriously at first, until I led them to the burning car. I was questioned for hours by detectives, and yes, they did suspect me, a homeless junkie, of foul play. But I stuck to my story. They did keep me in a holding cell for a few days, which they probably couldn't legally do, but I honestly didn't mind at all. Free showers and food. I was actually a bit bummed out when they eventually released me. I later found out that there were similar killings in San Francisco and Sacramento, and that the perpetrators were wanted by the FBI. I don't know for sure if they ever caught them. I can only hope that they did. After that night, I decided I had enough of living on the streets. The fear I experienced inspired me to get my shit together, finish college, and become an English teacher. I'm proud to say that I've been sober for almost 23 years. Sometimes seeing the ugliest side of humanity is the cure.
There's always a reason to be afraid.